Based on what you said about your experience at the company, I have two questions actually. One is about intuition. As you mentioned that managers told you that experience and intuition are such variables that you cannot really measure them. So how do you measure intuition in system dynamics models? And the second one is, I guess, about your recommendation about keeping prices high or even increasing them. And do you think it still applies in the current competitive world where many companies in the same industry have high standards and they have high level of support and service which they can give to the customers? So I guess the second question kind of leads to the discussion about present use of system dynamics.
Well, I don't think one sets out to model intuition. You model what the intuition is causing them to do in very specific circumstances, like adding to your physical capacity, hiring people. You see, this gets you from the abstract to the concrete. You talk about it in the context of an actual stream of decisions being made to control something. And when you get down to that level, you do have impressions, you do have attitudes that affect it, but it's almost being too elegant to say that you're now modeling intuition, because intuition becomes broken up into 100 dimensions, applied to all sorts of different places. And one modeling that I was involved in, that David Peterson of Vensim was also research assistant working on it. One of the very interesting things in that company was a set of pressures going on between finance and production. Pressures by finance to hold down inventories and the effect that that's having on the entire company. But that set of just psychological influence pressures that were going on, very important in that model, and you sensed them as soon as you started talking to people. I mean, people were under that pressure, and they talked about it, and you could see it at work. And so it didn't take much of an expertise to realize there was something there. For example, the very first time I walked through that factory, I knew something was wrong. Here was a whole factory full of machine tools, and a third of them were shut off. A third of them were turned on and running and not doing any work, nothing in them. And a third of them were, in fact, producing product. And I stopped beside one that was running with doing nothing, and the operator beside it, and I said, what's going on here? And he says, well, I'm waiting for some materials to work on. And you dig behind that, and you found that the pressures against inventories were so great that people were being starved for anything to work on. And you can find that many, many places. It's not at all unique to that company. Yes?
You mentioned that DEC with time didn't maybe have failed to adopt the model or a modeling process. Why is it so hard to implement models or to change mental models? And if we do change mental models, does that automatically lead to change, like practical, real change?
Well, if you can change the mental models, I think it does lead to change. But people are so deeply immersed in and so deeply and fundamentally embrace the paradigm that they've lived in that it's very difficult to change. And sometimes you have to conclude that the real route to success is to outlive them. Some examples. Going back to that same one I mentioned that had the pressures between finance and production. We did modeling there that also had some of these unexpected results. I mean, the model showed things that nobody realized was happening in the company, but when you looked carefully at the data, you found it was there. The policies that came out, they had two big problems, falling market share and high instability of production from one period of 2 or 3 years to the next. We developed a model that showed how all these were happening. I never had anybody in any part of that company differ with the assumptions in the model once we had sort of refined it and talked to a lot of people and captured what they said. Nobody that I know of ever differed with the fact that the model was producing the kind of behavior that the company had been experiencing. Nobody differed with the proposal that certain changes in policy would solve both of those major problems. There was, however, still a fundamental difficulty. And those two policies we wanted to recommend were diametrically opposite to what 3 generations of top management had made public speeches about as the basis for their success. The 3 generations of top management were all alive, all in town, all stockholders, and all on the board. What is a graduate of the Harvard Business School who's running the company now going to do in the face of that set of pressures? It's a very difficult situation. And what this really required was that as you go into a business cycle recession, you keep up production, you don't cut back. Again, the fear of inventories. The fear of excess inventories led them to cut back production further than the market would have cut back orders. And it turns out there's a truth in the corporate world that very few people seem to realize, and that is that you cannot sell what you do not make. I can almost guarantee to find that in 95% of corporations, either for the corporation as a whole, for a division, or at least for a product line. That it is the lack of ability to fill an order that is limiting their market, because people won't order what they can't get. So the proposed policies would have said, keep up production in a downturn. And it was a product that could be stored, and if you were willing to finance it, you could put it in a warehouse and almost certainly sell it later. So further along, I think largely as a gesture of goodwill toward me, they said, okay, this time we'll cut back only half as much as we were planning to, and we will allocate the tens of millions of dollars to put these units in inventory. Well, as the saying in the company went, as the recession came and began to revive, they said every time they scheduled one of these units for the inventory, some damn fool went and sold it. Every time. They never did get one in the warehouse. And the president was quoted as saying this had meant $10 million net profit after taxes they otherwise would not have made. And in the next business downturn, they couldn't bring themselves to do it again. Now, that goes to a statement I think you'll find in Wiener's Cybernetics, where he says, if you go in and study a system, you will change it. You can't study it without affecting what people do. I would assert that it's one of the biggest problems in system dynamics is to find a way to affect what people do. And that you can go around and you can talk to people, you can show them models, you can talk about the dynamics, and still getting that mental model reorganized is difficult. It can be done. We've seen examples, I think, of it being done, but it is not easy. And so I think there's also the early days of system dynamics. While we're on the history, I think the early days of system dynamics had a procedure that did not lend itself well to changing people's mental models. What we did as a system dynamics expert was to go in, talk to people, gather our insights and information, go away and make a model and bring it back and tell them what we had discovered. And that is entirely too big a step for people to jump across. I think some people now, some of the consultants in the field, including my son Nathan maybe, who has said to me once that if he, well, that first of all, at one stage anyway, he was taking his computer with him, and even on the first conversation, beginning to put on the screen what people were talking about, beginning to hook it up, beginning to see what would happen. He made the assertion to me once that if he worked more than a half a day on that model, when he was away from them, he would open up a communication gap that was almost impossible to close again. Now, that's a very different approach, you see, from going away and making the model in absentia. The point being that the people must participate in every step, agree with every step, believe that it is their mental model that you are modeling, and begin step by step, even throughout the process, to cause them to want to question their mental models, to see new insights, to begin to shift gradually as the process continues. So I think one of the big challenges, and Nelson, you've been asking about what academia can do. I think this process of how people change their mental models is a very interesting field that could benefit from exploration.
Yeah, well, in the history of system dynamics, I just had a question. Did you envision that the methods of system dynamics were not applicable for some problems? Did you, when you when you invented system dynamics, did you think that some problems should be better solved by other methodologies or methods?
Well, I think our concept of applicability and where system dynamics can be used has clearly expanded through time. Initially, it was industrial dynamics. It wasn't system dynamics. It was only after we had applied it to cities and a few other things outside of the corporate world that we felt industrial dynamics was much too limiting a word or name, and we changed to system dynamics in order to have the name at least open the door to other things. Then as we found applications in medicine, as we found applications in urban affairs, as we found various applications, I think we gradually began to realize that it dealt with anything where things change through time. And that covers a very large fraction of what people are interested in.
Okay, thanks.
This gets to one specific insight within industrial dynamics that I found very interesting. You already talked about how you went into a situation where people were assuming that the fluctuations in their workforce and their inventories was being driven by the business cycle. And through the modeling, you show that the internal policies and structure were, in fact, capable and most likely to be creating that independent of the business cycle. In one of the appendices in industrial dynamics, you tend to take another great leap and work back and say, in fact, not only is the business cycle not creating the internal fluctuation, but it may be the internal fluctuation and people's belief that the external structure is related to it that then creates the cycles in the business. Specifically, that's talking about how people, by building up their inventory, then need to sell that inventory off and begin to drive a buying cycle, either industry-specific or economy-specific, from the internal. So you actually made that, what I think is a very big conceptual leap to reverse the direction of causation there. How did that come about? And I think of it in part because of Milo's question about industrial dynamics and broadening the scope. That is no longer a purely industrial dynamics question. You're beginning to actually address overall broader economic questions and behavior with that leap. So let me rephrase it. How did you make the leap, and is that the way you move upward?
Well, I suppose, given my frame of mind, once that I see that the distribution system is producing business cycle fluctuations, you then say, well, that's where they come from. That's where the business cycle comes from. You see, you start in the real world with people who think that whatever is happening to them is being imposed on them from the outside. And I think a fairly fundamental system dynamics attitude is that whatever is happening, including the bad things that are happening, are probably being generated inside your own system. And or put it another way, you define the boundaries of the system, so that's true. The things that are happening, you want to know what is causing them. And usually you find that it's what people are doing And time after time, you find that what they are doing to solve the problem is, in fact, the cause. We've had a recent airplane tragedy out over beyond Long Island, crashing in apparently no problem with the airplane. And in the aircraft world, there's a dynamic called the death spiral for airplanes, and it comes in a situation where the pilot not competent to fly in fog gets the impression that his airplane is diving. You lift back on the nose to bring it out of the dive, but it continues to seem like it's diving. And you do more and more of this, and it's not really diving, it's in a turn. And the more you pull back, the tighter the turn until it crashes or the wings come off. And this happens, this is well known. And this is a situation in what the person is doing is causing the problem, which in turn causes the person to do more of what is causing the problem. And you see that in young companies. They go through a death spiral. They get started, and they do more and more of what's causing the trouble, maybe cutting prices, for example, down to the point where they can't possibly survive. Mature, long-lived organizations have other forces that keep this process from running all the way to the end. But if you take a family in great internal psychiatric difficulty, it seems to me that in general they all know they're in trouble. They all think they're doing something to make matters better, and everything everybody does makes it worse. You find this at almost every level, from personal, individual psychiatry to group psychiatry to the corporation to national governments. Time after time you see nations doing things to solve a problem that in fact represents part of the cause. You see it in international power politics. And I think in system dynamics there's not been enough courage to really attack some of those big social problems and bring them down to manageable proportions.